With a spool of telephone wire in one hand and a handset in the other, he began a suicidal sprint. He could have taken $1 million wound ticket home to the rolling hills of Clinton County, Kentucky. He wasn't fighting for a map, he was fighting for the boys in the foxholes who would become his only family. The Germans were cornered, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous. He didn't retreat. He picked up the handset and gave the coordinates for his own position. They blurred his vision and compressed his lungs until he could barely breathe. Imagine standing in a frozen ditch, the temperature 10 degrees below zero, watching 6 heavy German tanks crest a ridgeline like tigers, the most feared armor in the war. Behind them, 600 elite German mountain troops are moving through the tree line. You are 5'6" and weigh 120 pounds. You are not a frontline infantryman. You are an intelligence officer who should be miles behind the lines looking at maps. But the forward observers are dead. The radio is silent. If those tanks reach the American foxholes, your battalion will be erased from history. You have a choice: stay in the safety of the command post or run 400 yards across an open, snow-covered field under direct artillery fire to become the eyes of the big guns. Garlin Murl Conner didn't hesitate. With a spool of telephone wire in one hand and a handset in the other, he began a suicidal sprint. This is the story of a Kentucky tobacco farmer who decided that he and he alone would stand between the German army and the total collapse of the Allied front. By January 1945, Murl Conner had been at war for nearly 4 years. He had survived 4 amphibious landings, 10 major campaigns, and had been wounded 7 times. 3 weeks prior to this morning, he was lying in a hospital bed with shrapnel wounds that hadn't even fully scarred over. He could have stayed in the hospital. He could have taken $1 million wound ticket home to the rolling hills of Clinton County, Kentucky. But Conner was a man defined by a quiet, unbreakable loyalty. Back home, the nearest school was 15 miles away. He had learned early that if you wanted something done, you did it yourself, no matter how far you had to walk. In the frozen mud of France, that farm boy grit had transformed into a legendary status within the 3rd Battalion. His men didn't just respect him, they looked for him when the world started exploding. He wasn't fighting for a map, he was fighting for the boys in the foxholes who would become his only family. The setting was the Colmar Pocket, a jagged 850-square-mile wedge of French territory that the German 19th Army refused to surrender. While the world's attention was fixed 300 miles north, the soldiers in Alsace were fighting in a literal icebox. Hitler had launched Operation Nordwind, a desperate final offensive to shatter the Allied lines in the south. The Germans were cornered, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous. They had massed their most feared weapon, the Mark VI Tiger. With its 88mm gun and nearly 7 inches of frontal armor, the Tiger was a psychological terror. American tanks often required 5-to-1 odds to take a single Tiger down. On January 24th, the 3rd Battalion had 0 tanks. They had no tank destroyers. They were facing an armored juggernaut with nothing but rifles and a few machine guns. The only thing the Americans had was the steel rain, the 105mm howitzers miles away, and they were useless without someone to tell them where to land. The climax of the battle occurred when the Tigers and infantry closed within 30 yards of Conner's shallow ditch. The German commanders realized the American artillery was being directed with supernatural precision and turned their 88mm guns toward the lone man in the snow. Conner could see the breath of the German soldiers. He could see the black German cross on the tanks. He didn't retreat. He picked up the handset and gave the coordinates for his own position. The artillery officer on the other end went silent, then asked him to repeat. Conner didn't stutter. "Fire on my position." He was calling for a wall of high explosives to land within the 50-yard kill zone where he was lying. For the next hour, he lay flat as 12 guns saturated his coordinates. He was effectively using himself as a human magnet for the steel rain, gambling that the ditch would protect him while the shells vaporized the Germans around him. In those 2 hours, the tobacco farmer from Kentucky ceased to exist. He became something elemental, a ghost in the snow, directing the thunder of the gods. As the shells hammered the earth, the concussion waves were so violent they blurred his vision and compressed his lungs until he could barely breathe. Each blast lifted him off the ground and slammed him back into the frozen dirt. But through the ringing in his ears and the blinding smoke, his voice remained steady on the wire. Drop 20, repeat fire. He was no longer a man, he was a precision instrument of destruction. The German infantry, who had survived the horrors of the Eastern Front, had never seen anything like it. They weren't fighting a battalion, they were fighting a single, invisible force that seemed to command the very sky to fall on them. By the time the smoke cleared, the little man was still there, but the German assault was shattered. The 400 yards of telephone wire trailing behind Conner as he ran into no man's land is the ultimate symbol of his story. That wire was a physical manifestation of his connection to his brothers in arms. It was fragile, easily cut by shrapnel, and thin, much like Conner himself. Yet, as long as that line remained intact, the entire power of the American industrial machine was channeled through his fingertips. It represents the thin thread of hope that holds a defensive line together. In a war of massive movements and millions of men, the wire reminds us that history often hangs on a single person's willingness to stay connected to their post when every instinct screams to run. The wire didn't just carry coordinates, it carried the survival of the 3rd Battalion. Conner was the bridge between the helpless men in the foxholes and the salvation of the big guns. Garlin Murl Conner survived that day, but he didn't talk about it. He went back to Kentucky, back to the tobacco farm, and back to the quiet life of a man who had seen enough fire for 10 lifetimes. For decades, his story was a footnote, and his 4 silver stars were tucked away in a drawer. It took over 70 years of tireless work by his widow, Pauline, and his fellow veterans to get the world to recognize what happened in that ditch. In 2018, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He remains a testament to the fact that the greatest heroes aren't always the biggest men. They are the ones who stay on the line. Dear audience, please share your thoughts in comments. Thanks for watching.